I always feel like somebody's watching me and I have no privacy. Rockwell with Michael Jackson on backup vocals. Rockwell, whose real name was Kennedy Gordy, which is a very famous last name if you recognize it, may have been singing about paranoia in 1984, but 40 years later, it's definitely not paranoia. It's fact. From phones listening into our conversations to CCTV cameras everywhere and companies desperate to leave their cookies on our electronic devices, it seems like anyone can see anything at any time. It's a feeling Eastern Europeans who lived through the Cold War recognize very well. Although for them, the constant surveillance was done through a network of people watching everything that was going on and reporting it to the authorities. And it's a feeling coming to a London near you in very short order with the construction of a massive super embassy for China. The embassy has not been arranged without protest. The approval for construction has been argued and protested ad infinitum in newspaper articles, in person, and on Twitter. It's been a strangely one-sided argument as well. Other than the folks approving each level of necessary government stamps, absolutely no one seems to be in favor of a massive Chinese outpost in the center of London with blacked out construction blueprints at a time when China has issued bounties on Hong Kong activists, many of whom live in the UK. Not to mention proximity to essential lines of communication, leaving them open to sabotage at the same time. Chinese and Russian ships have been cutting communications cables in the ocean with regularity. Nor is this the first accusation China has faced of running its own police force inside other sovereign nations. It's just a much bigger police station. But as we constantly say, everything old is new again. And this is not the first time a nation has set up shop in other places for nefarious purposes. The end of World War II saw Austria divided into occupation zones, much like Berlin. Protestations that Anschluss had been forced by Hitler and Germany may have carried some weight. After all, Austria was allowed to go its own way as long as it remained neutral after 1955. But the "we were also the victims" argument didn't have the poignant appeal it did for places like Czechoslovakia or France. The 1943 Moscow Conference pointedly stated that Austria had a responsibility for its participation in the war at the side of Hitlerite Germany. The journey from occupied zones to neutrality put Vienna squarely on the map as the center of world espionage during the Cold War. Every spy who was anyone was operating in the former imperial city and in Austria as a whole. Indeed, in October 1950, the U.S. diplomat Coburn Kidd said that 1/4 of Salzburg was engaged with one or another of the various sneaky departments and bureaus of various nations who had been a part of the Allied victory. The payments for these activities was an important and substantial source of income for citizens beset by massive inflation and rebuilding from the war. The Soviets, however, approached their occupation a bit differently than everyone else. For one, the rules for Soviet citizens involved in the Austrian occupation were incredibly harsh. They were not allowed to visit local restaurants or cafes, theaters or cinemas. They were not allowed to fraternize in any way with locals or those in Allied military zones. They certainly couldn't date or carry out affairs with locals, and clubs were completely off limits. The occupiers were so constrained and constricted that Vienna was considered a hardship tour. And those stationed there got two 45 days blocks of leave per year. Soviet citizen behavior was watched and policed through an estimated 4,000 informants and an auxiliary police force made up of the members of the Austrian Communist Party, all overseen by SMERSH, the dreaded acronym of the Smerchspielnum, an organization with absolutely no illusions about their mission. It was contained directly in their name: death to spies. Soviet diplomats and military members caught violating the rules were treated harshly. In the words of one SMERSH officer, Vitaly Nikolsky, the violators were immediately sent to the country's border under a military convoy, regardless of their rank and position. Later in the motherland, harsh party punishment was applied. But the treatment of Soviet citizens, harsh as it was, absolutely paled in comparison to the treatment meted out to any Westerners, primarily Austrians, who were along for the rule-breaking ride. An Austrian woman who had an affair with a Soviet citizen opened herself up to kidnapping the moment she stepped foot in the Soviet occupation zone. And once she was kidnapped, she disappeared. Files relating to the fates of those kidnapped Austrians were not opened until after the fall of the Soviet Union. Their families knew nothing about what happened to them for, in some cases, more than 60 years. But those families soon discovered finding out the missing fate of their loved one could be worse than not knowing. Ermine Roeder's final cry for leniency in 1951 was finally able to be read in 2001, and it's absolutely heart-wrenching. I implore you, I who stand before you orphaned, stateless, without helpers or friends, only spare my wretched life, spare me this grisly death. Hermine, who was 24 years old, was kidnapped from Vienna. She was taken to the Soviet intelligence complex in Baden, Austria, and tried for espionage. She was convicted and then transported to Moscow, where she was shot, cremated, and had her ashes summarily scattered. Her crime was having a love affair with a Soviet military service member. By the end of the occupation in 1955, there were 50,000 Soviets stationed in Vienna. The kidnappings and executions largely stopped in 1953 when Stalin died. But occupation by the Soviets was never exactly nice. Finally, on May 15, 1955, Leopold Fiegel appeared on the balcony of Belvedere Palace waving a treaty and saying, "Austria is free!" in German, of course. By October 25th, all occupying troops had left Austria, and the spy games well and truly began. Of course, it wasn't just Austria, and it wasn't just the Soviets setting up sneaky outposts connected to their diplomatic missions throughout history. During World War I, before America's entry into the conflict, the Kaiser's Germany was fairly certain that if America did join the war, it would not be in support of the German fatherland. To this end, there were German efforts to discourage U.S. participation, but in typical bombastic Kaiser style, they were more focused on making Americans too afraid to join rather than assuring them it just wasn't their fight. It was to manufacture mayhem that a German post was set up in the heart of New York City on West 15th Street in a brothel. The brothel was run by a German woman who was a former opera singer and received its funding directly from the German consulate. Their main search and recruitment was for those with explosives experience, which was put to devastating use in a sabotage attack on the Black Tom munitions site on July 30th, 1916. The Black Tom munitions site was on the Jersey side of New York Harbor and was the holding facility for approximately 2 million pounds of small arms and ammunition, which were awaiting shipment to Russia. The United States was officially neutral at this time, but the German agents operating out of Manhattan were determined to stop the weapons from reaching the World War I Allied trenches. The explosion, actually several smaller explosions, which began just after 2 in the morning. They were so powerful that window panes in Times Square and the stained glass windows of St. Patrick's Cathedral were shattered. 7 people were killed in the explosions, and even the Statue of Liberty was hit by shrapnel, damaging her torch and closing it to tourists. Although the Black Tom explosion is little remembered by most Americans in the 21st century, its consequences reached far beyond the eventual American entry into World War I. It was this act of sabotage that held the thoughts of President Franklin Roosevelt as the United States entered World War II. And it was a significant impetus in leading towards the internment of Japanese citizens in America during that war. It also resulted in the Espionage Act, which is still used to charge people like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden today. Of course, From Sarajevo to Red Africa deals with history, not current events. And so whatever the purpose of the Chinese mega-embassy in London happens to be, it's outside our purview. But within the 20th century alone, there is certainly a history to be examined in regards to the outposts of not exactly allied nations on foreign soil. It was actually the Chinese general and philosopher Sun Tzu who provided the last word in this case. All warfare is based on deception. There is no case where espionage is not used.
What to do